Hello, friends, and welcome back to Advaita Made Easy, episode number 2. So the title of today's lesson is The Problem with Neo-Advaita Teachings. And I just wanted to preface this by saying that I don't actually believe that there are problems in reality, as in something that's wrong or bad or shouldn't be happening. Everything is serving its rightful purpose in reality. I'm just using the word problem here loosely as reference to things that can cause difficulties maybe, or challenges. And I get asked very often what I think about Neo-Advaita teachings, or certain Neo-Advaita teachers especially. And so I wanted to make a video that addresses this question, mostly so that I can have a link to send people from now on, rather than just answering the question all the time, but also because I think this is a really important issue for us in the spiritual community. As a Law of One teacher and ACIM teacher, I often get questions from my ACIM students or just non-duality students who say, hey, you're teaching reincarnation over here in Law of One, but non-duality in ACIM, isn't reincarnation wrong? Because non-duality says there's no person and nothing but the source exists and all this stuff. Why are you teaching reincarnation? Or even shadow work, right? Shadow work, well, there's no person to look inside and there's no shadows to heal. There's just nothing, right? Why do you teach healing and stuff like that? So obviously this is a nuance we have to work out, because the spiritual ego, being inherently dualistic, is incapable of nuance. It wants an all or nothing approach to everything, one way or another. So when the spiritual ego learns about non-duality, it tends to use that knowledge to invalidate or discredit everything else. When in truth, the real understanding of non-duality should make everything equally valid. All spiritual teachings, all spiritual paths in the light of non-duality should be seen as equally valid. But non-duality tends to be a really sort of attractive, shiny object for the spiritual ego, which always wants the quickest, hack or technique or cheat code to enlightenment. I don't want to do all this inner healing and purification. I don't want to sit in meditation for the next 10 years and do self-inquiry and devotion. Just give me a direct teaching. I can just go straight to the answer and be enlightened. And Neo-Advaita sort of does exactly that for the spiritual ego by saying, all other spiritual teachings just reinforce the ego. This is the only message you need. Nothing exists. There's no person. There's nobody to get enlightened. Boom, all your problems are solved. So the ego clings to that message really strongly because it comes off as, oh, this is the most superior teaching of all. But realization doesn't work this way, because the soul is loaded up with karmas and vasanas that need to be purified from the soul. And intellectual analysis or information alone cannot do that. So all that typically does is to give the ego even more spiritual concepts to weaponize against you and become even more prideful with. So in addressing this issue of Neo-Advaita, I want to share with you what is probably the ultimate paradox of the enlightenment path. There's many ways we can break down the enlightenment path and talk about, different stages that we move through as the mind is gradually killed and silenced, or different stages of awareness that are gained as it continually expands and deepens. But I just want to give a really simple model that only involves 2 basic steps. Now, if you go to a guru or a Zen master, let's say, and you ask them, what do I need to do to get enlightened? They're typically going to give you one of 2 answers. They're either going to say, unless you want enlightenment worse than your next breath, you shall not attain it. Or the other message you'll get from a guru is, there's absolutely nothing you can do to get enlightened. You're already that, you're already the self, forget all about it. Just realize you're that and be done with it. So these 2 answers are basically the 2 stages or paths of enlightenment that are both integral and necessary and really they merge into one. But we could say that the first step is to desire enlightenment, freedom, more than anything else. To have the desire for freedom burn so hot within you that it melts away all other desires and everything in its way. We could call this the path of bhakti, the path of devotion. And then the second answer, or the second path, is to give up the desire for enlightenment completely through the knowledge that I am that already. There can't be an alternative. I am that, which means who cares? Who wants enlightenment? It's already the case. It's already the fact of the matter. And we call this JNANA, or the path of knowledge. Now, I want to stress that these two stages are absolutely critical in that they must follow this exact order of devotion first and then knowledge. You cannot skip over devotion and try to jump straight to knowledge. You can't skip over step one and jump straight to step two. This is absolutely the number one mistake that I see people making in the non-duality community, and especially in the Neo-Advaita community, which kind of just parrots endlessly. No, there's nobody here. There's nobody to devote. There's nobody to want enlightenment. There's nobody to love God. There's no one to even ask these questions. There's just nothing. Just accept it. There's a few popular Neo-Advaita teachers who many of you would know if I brought them up, who just, it is just astounding to watch their Q&A videos with people. They just gaslight the hell out of everybody who asks them a question. You know, somebody in the audience will say, "Hi, so I just had a question about non-doership. So I'm just trying to understand the concept when you say that there's there's no questioner. There's no one asking this question. There's no one up here answering the question. There's just nothing." Oh, okay, thank you. But see, so my question is though, I'm just trying to understand what you mean when you say, no, there's no meaning. There's no one to have meaning. There's no questioner. There's no question. There's just nothingness. There's just emptiness. Okay, thanks. They put the mic down. Literally anybody can do that. Steamrolling someone with non-duality concepts is not helpful to them. Anybody can get up on a stool in front of an audience and just gaslight everybody and say, no, there's just nothing, there's nobody. That's not a spiritual teaching. That's not helpful. You know, you have to meet people where they're at. Yes, the highest possible understanding, the Mount Everest realization will be at some point that there is nobody to ask the question. But when someone's loaded up with karma and extremely identified with spiritual ego, we need to give them a teaching or a pointer that can help them get from one step to another. You can't ask a second grader to pass a trigonometry exam, right? You can't expect people with massive ego identification to understand the highest message of non-duality. So let's teach it in a way that facilitates understanding. So that's my first problem with Neo-Advaita, is that it's this sort of all masculine, zero feminine approach to the enlightenment path. You know, it's just so dry and tasteless. It's all form, no essence. And who wants that kind of enlightenment? The highest realization of all is love. And so if enlightenment doesn't lead you there, then it isn't the final enlightenment yet. So the problem with Neo-Advaita teachings, if there is one, is that they're basically totally devoid of love. They just stress that the nature of reality is emptiness and nothingness and voidness, and that's it. Just accept that. And that's certainly an aspect, a critical aspect of reality, right? Of course. But what emptiness is pregnant with is love, oneness, bliss. This is the basic teaching of Advaita. Sat Chidananda, existence, consciousness, bliss, which means that beyond this dualistic mind, existence and consciousness are one. And when that is realized, it is experienced as bliss, because the source and its highest essence that can be experienced is pure bliss. So if your teachings aren't leading people to that, then that's not the highest teaching yet. It might be an ingredient, but it isn't the whole recipe. And Neo-Advaita teachings tend to heavily negate the world and treat it like some giant mistake or some huge error to be avoided. It's all duality. But like, what's more dualistic than that, right? The manifest and the unmanifest are one. So why are we obsessing over the unmanifest and the void and the nothingness and then negating the manifest? Sounds like a spiritual ego with a bunch of non-duality concepts. Shankara, the founder of Advaita, his basic 3-point teaching on the nature of reality was, all is Brahman, the world does not exist, and the world is Brahman. See, well, that sounds like a contradiction. And that's the essence of all spiritual teachings, is that they seem paradoxical to the intellect. But what Shankara is pointing to, of course, is that only Brahman, the absolute, is real. And when the world is seen as different from that or apart from that reality, then it's not real. It's a made-up figment of the mind. But when the world is seen as Brahman, that's the real world, as the Course in Miracles calls it. The world is the expression, the manifest form of the absolute. So it isn't to be negated, it isn't to be denied as invalid, it is to be seen in its true light. So, none of this is to say that all Neo-Advaita teachers are to be avoided or something. That's not what I'm saying. I've seen a few good ones who have, a lot more balance in their teachings, but they tend to be harder to find in my experience. So Neo-Advaita teachings can be great if they're kept in balance with love and devotion, kept in perspective. It's only when they're taken in this all or nothing way that leads to trouble. And to give you an example, I had a student in my masterclass who was making really great progress for a while. And you could see on each weekly call that his mind was becoming quieter and humbler as time was going on. And, he had fewer questions and more gratitude and things like that. And then he sort of disappeared suddenly for a few months, 3 to 4 months maybe. And then he reappeared on my Facebook group as a completely different character. He started commenting on all of my posts, challenging everything I was saying. And he kept quoting these Neo-Advaita teachers, the books he was reading and stuff. And I was like, uh-oh, here we go. And eventually he started calling me a fraud and saying that all my teachings are reinforcing people's egos and, parroting the usual Neo-Advaita stuff like, there's nobody to want freedom, there's no journey, you're just leading people astray and deceiving them. One day I logged on and had over 100 notifications from this guy who had posted the same angry rant on like 100 of my posts because he wanted to make sure that I saw his post. And I thought, wow, clearly this is the demonstration of one who has achieved the supreme knowledge. Yes, this is enlightened behavior, isn't it? So I spoke with him a few times and tried to say, hey man, let's just agree to disagree and, be humble enough to be on different paths or whatever. But he didn't stop and kept posting the same rants every day on my Facebook posts. And so I had to block him. Now, none of this, I don't see this as a bad thing for him, right? That he fell into this trap. Clearly this was what his soul needed, as it awakened this kind of dormant part of his ego that needed to express itself so that he could become aware of it. So that's great in the long run, but it's that kind of arrogance that leads to extreme suffering on the spiritual path, which it's not a fun path to take. The path of devotion and humility is much easier in my experience. And so this leads me to the next big problem with Neo-Advaita teachings, is that one of the pinnacle teachings of Neo-Advaita tends to be that teaching people that desiring freedom is wrong because it just reinforces the ego, they say. Call off the search. There's nobody to get free. Give up your desire for enlightenment. And this is a huge mistake to teach people. The biggest mistake any spiritual teacher could ever make, in my opinion, is to teach people not to desire freedom. That's a natural stage of realization that will occur on the later stages of the enlightenment path, all on its own when that soul is ready. At the beginning, however, the desire for freedom is essential. Every great sage in history has said this. It is the most essential ingredient to liberation. And I'll tell you why. Because your desire for freedom is your true nature waking up from its sleep state, saying, I'm done dreaming, I'm ready for awakening. And the way that it works through the grogginess and heaviness of the sleep of ego identification is by desiring freedom. So when your desire for freedom is weak, it's the type of sleepiness that ego takes advantage of. The ego won't allow you to see all of its preservation strategies in your mind. But when your desire for freedom is very strong, you begin to see all of the ego's preservation strategies. Your desire for freedom is your inner guru. It is like an inner fire that illuminates your path through the darkness of the mind and shows you everything you need to see in order to get free from the ego's influence. One example is, you will begin to see that before your desire for freedom was all-consuming, the ego was only selecting spiritual teachings that would help to secretly preserve the ego, like law of attraction, self-empowerment, even non-duality. You start to see how the ego distorted all of those direct path teachings or enlightenment teachings to preserve itself. People make the same mistake when they come to non-duality that religious people make when they read the Bible or the Quran. This was what I got extremely annoyed with as a teenager in my early 20s, because I kept hearing all these Christians saying, I know the word of God and it's the absolute truth. And they would use their interpretation of those verses to abuse people or gaslight people. And even at a young age, I was like, shouldn't it be obvious that everyone's interpreting these scriptures differently, according to their own biases and reference frame? But ego is so arrogant that it believes that its own interpretation is the perfect absolute one and all others are wrong. And so ego does that with religion and non-duality, all the same. People become non-duality fundamentalists or ACIM fundamentalists. All other teachings are inferior. This is the one path. Oh, you're teaching law of attraction? That's invalid. That just reinforces ego. Shadow work? There's nobody to get healed. What an inferior teaching. You're just reinforcing people's ego. It's pure pride. It's pure arrogance. All spiritual teachings meet people where they are. Law of attraction, right? It's what gets people to the dance. It's what gets people interested in spirituality to begin with, who previously had no interest in it. And in 5 years, they'll be doing yoga and meditation probably, right? So who are you to say it's an inferior teaching? Must be a spiritual ego talking, yeah? So if it attracts people to look inwards, it's the perfect teaching for them at that stage. So the more you desire to be free from the influence of ego, the more you desire to experience your true nature, the more humble you become. Because you're willing to do whatever it takes, right? When you want something bad enough. And that's what opens spiritual vision, allowing you to see that all things are equally divine and equally valid. So here's why this problem develops. Because people want to skip over devotion completely and go straight to knowledge. Because again, ego loves shiny concepts. It's like little trophies on its shelf. Look at all these concepts I can explain. I'm so enlightened. It doesn't work that way. Devotion and knowledge are one ultimately. They merge into one another. So you can't have one without the other. True devotion will lead you to knowledge naturally, and true knowledge will lead you to devotion. So the problem is that people listen to these teachers who are trying to give them the Mount Everest spiritual teaching that there's just nothing. And yes, that's true, but if you haven't done the preliminary work to gain the capacity for that kind of realization, it's just going to land on your ego and fatten up your ego with more non-duality, shiny concepts that it wants to impress people with and disagree with people on Instagram. So what is that preliminary work that you need to have that realization not land on pride? It's the burning desire for freedom. with every fiber and cell in your beingness. You need to first become a living sacrifice to the divine. Say, I don't know anything. I'm just here to be your servant. I'm only here to be your devotee. That's the attitude for liberation. So without this extremely intense desire and devotion to freedom, ego is gonna hijack it. An extremely intense desire for freedom is the foundation of all true spirituality. And this is the path of the mystics. And this is the reason that it is the safeguard against these Neo-Advaita teachings that can fatten up the ego, because devotion creates humility. And as David Hawkins said, humility is the most important virtue for reaching enlightenment. And I completely agree with him, because again, we don't know anything. We just think we do. And when we hear all these non-duality teachings, ego goes, oh, now I really know the nature of things. I'll reach it with my mind. So of all of the factors that determine if you will truly find freedom or stay bound to the wheel of samsara, the desire for freedom is number one. And to teach people to not have that desire is a massive error in teaching, in my opinion. Now, I'm gonna do a video in this series on both of these paths of bhakti and jnana, or devotion and knowledge, but I'm just sort of giving you the precursor in today's video. Now, one last thing I wanna say is that the other big problem of skipping over devotion and going straight to knowledge is that without the humility that devotion brings to the soul, your karmas will make it so that life has to humble you and expose your arrogance to you. And this is, again, a very painful approach to awakening. I ran into this problem myself when I left Christianity. I had so much of the worship and the bhakti in Christianity, but really no knowledge of the divine. And so that's what I was hungry for. And I ran into Eastern teachings and I completely abandoned all love, devotion, or worship of God for simply the knowledge of God. And that was a good part of my journey. It helped a lot, up to a certain point where I ran into this wall where I said, hey, God, I know all these concepts. I understand the nature of reality as oneness and all this stuff. Why am I not happy? Why do I still feel like there's a void inside that can't be filled? Why am I still, mildly suffering all day, every day? And one day, a voice responded to this question finally and said, Aaron, did you forget that you used to love me? And I went, oh, yes, I did. I completely forgot that I used to spend afternoons locked in my room, dancing and worshiping and singing to you and pouring my heart out to you. But a Neo-Advaita teacher might see that and go, huh, who are you worshiping? There's nobody to worship. There's no worshiper. There's just nothing. What a waste of time. So that's a painful approach to awakening. Life will humble you. Right? Who are you to be so arrogant that you're not going to worship the divine, that you're above that because you've realized the supreme truth? Those who realize the supreme truth still worship and still devote themselves, because the realization is that's the game God's playing. That's why all this is happening. God wants to have the illusion of a subject-object relationship. It isn't wrong, it isn't a mistake, and it definitely isn't to be avoided. The source will have no issue allowing you to fall into pain and difficulty so that you can grow humbler. Because again, that's the essential ingredient to enlightenment. There's more God realization in a single act of humility than all of the knowledge and sacred scriptures combined. The source is not to be found in intellectual prowess, which is typically what Neo-Advaita tries to serve people. If somebody wants to find God, let them look on everything with love first. Let them not negate everything they see as it's all duality, it's all an illusion. I know that there's just nothing. Divine reality cannot be known in any other way than in the form of unconditional love in everything you look upon. It cannot be known intellectually. Reality can only be seen through the heart. The mind can't see it. So when you try to let the mind say, oh, there's just nothing, none of this is here, And that's the highest truth. It's not the highest truth. It's just another concept in the way of truth. Love reveals oneness, and oneness reveals that, oh, it's all nothing, in the sense that it's no thing. It's not a separate thing. Nothing is apart from me as a thing or an object. It's all myself. And that realization leads to unconditional love. So the best, Advaita analogy I've heard for this is the way that a bumblebee approaches a flower. The bee represents the mind trying to achieve self-realization. The flower is the flower of divine truth. When that bee is outside the flower, it's buzzing and moving rapidly and loudly and noisily. But when that bee finally lands on the flower and drinks of the nectar, it becomes quiet and still, and it just enjoys the sweetness of the flower. That's what the mind who sees the truth becomes like. It becomes filled with the beauty of divine love. Not knowledge, not nothingness, not emptiness. That's part of the equation that leads to the highest realization of love. The mind will never be motivated to give up its mental tendencies and thought patterns through a negative, through just negating everything all the time. You have to show the mind something more worthwhile, something more enjoyable than thinking, something more peaceful and fulfilling. And the only thing that can show the mind that is the love of God, devotion to God. Until you have that, the mind will never come to stillness. And no better example of this is Nisargadatta, who is kind of known as being the great sage of JNANA, right, or knowledge. But Nisargadatta considered himself to be a Bhakta first, and said that all of his knowledge was gained by way of devotion. And Nisargadatta's guru, Siddharameshwar Maharaj, who's one of my favorite sages to read, was also a Bhakta. And he had some beautiful teachings about what he called devotion after liberation, which you can find in one of his books, Master of Self-Realization. And I just think it summarizes everything I've said here perfectly. So I'll just conclude by reading this passage to you. He says, when the state of Brahman is attained, one thinks that devotion with its inherent duality is no longer needed. One should not suffer from the pride of having achieved any such state. When one says that when liberation is attained, devotion does not remain, this is the pride of knowledge. Please, may you give me devotion to you. You may ask me, why are you requesting devotion when I have given you liberation, which is attainable only after millions of births? And I will say that for me to be deprived of devotion to the Guru is the greatest hindrance. So please give me that devotion which is beyond liberation. I do not want liberation, which is dry and tasteless. Liberation is necessary to have the understanding of reality. But please give me devotion to you. Give me the worship of you, which is superior to liberation. Unfathomable is the greatness of your devotion. He who becomes one with you holds all of your glory. Devotion contains within itself liberation. By devotion, the liberation becomes sanctified. Even if I will gain liberation, I desire only to be your devotee.